Okay, it's going to be a hopefully pretty quick lesson today on operating a small business. It's going to really carry forward with what we were talking about the last class about starting a small business, but here we go. So we're going to discuss some of the details regarding operating a small business today. This is going to include revenue, fixed expenses, variable expenses, profit, loss, breaking even, and making profitable decisions. Again, hopefully it won't be too long of a lesson today. Let's get rolling. So with revenue and expenses, businesses have revenue, and revenue is just a fancy word for money earned, so it's the amount of money you're taking in, and expenses, which of course is money spent. Now your expenses can be broken down into two categories. You can have fixed expenses, which are costs that occur regularly and don't change in price. So a fixed expense, as it kind of sounds, they're fixed in place, they're the same thing every single time, and they occur regularly, right? Now variable expenses are the other kind. Variable expenses are ones that vary from time to time. So in other words, they either change in price, so in other words, how much you're paying every now and then, or when they are required to be paid, right? So in other words, it might be something unpredictable, might be a variable expense, like if something happened unpredictably and they're like, oh, now I got to pay for that, that would be a variable expense. Now businesses need to have more revenue than expenses in order to make something we call a profit. So if you have more revenue than expenses, you're going to be making a profit off that. You're going to be making money. So this little bar graph kind of shows, I don't know what kind of a business this was for. In their first year, their revenue was higher than their expenses. So in other words, they had a good first year, they had profit. In the previous year though, notice their expenses were higher than their revenue. So in other words, they lost money that year. But then in the current year, they have way more revenue than they do expenses. So they have massive profit in the current year. Okay. All right, we'll do a quick example here. Classify the following as revenue, fixed expenses, or variable expenses. So there's two different groups here. So this line right here is going to divide it into two different pieces. So we've got a lot to look at here. I want you to think about it in terms of revenue, fixed expenses, or variable expenses. And remember, revenue is what's making you money, whereas expenses are what's making you lose some money. It's things you actually have to pay for. Fixed expenses, again, are the ones that stay the same over time and they're regular. So in other words, they happen on a frequent basis. Whereas variable expenses are the ones that are a little more unpredictable. They kind of jump around. All right, for the first one here, groceries. Okay, I'm gonna like just assume right out the gates that this isn't for a business. It's just for like your home. Although your home can kind of be like your own little personal business. It's like your own life, right? So groceries, $875.23. Well, would that be revenue, a fixed expense, or a variable expense? Well, for groceries, I would actually consider that more of a variable expense because, again, it can change from time to time. You're unlikely to pay the exact same amount for groceries every single month or whatever. So I would definitely call that a variable expense. A payment from Mrs. Harrison. So if you're getting a payment from Mrs. Harrison, that means you're getting paid by her. So that's a revenue. So I'll just call it an R. Gas for your car, $296.74. I think it's pretty clear this is going to be some sort of expense, but let's think about whether it's fixed or variable. Keep in mind, gas prices jump around. Gas prices seem to always change like pretty much every other day. I would call that more of a variable expense. Next one, payment from Mr. Dorn. Again, it's a payment from someone. That's a revenue. Food containers. That's all it really says here. I'm going to assume that that means you had to buy some food containers. I doubt that's something that you do all the time, so I would call that a variable expense. Payment from Mrs. Towers, well, that's going to be a revenue because you got paid from Mrs. Towers. Tip from Mrs. Towers, okay, so it's more than just the payment, it's also just a tip on top of that, so an extra reward, that's a revenue. Groceries, again, we talked about that one before, it's a variable expense, and notice we can actually confirm it's a variable expense this time by looking at the cost. Groceries appears in this list twice, but they have totally different costs, so it's got to be variable. Car insurance, so in other words, what you're paying on your car insurance. That one, I think we should probably consider a fixed expense because generally speaking, your car insurance payments stay the same. They might change like from one year to the next, but your monthly payments generally stay the same. So I'll say that's a fixed expense. Check from Mr. Rogers. So that means, I guess, Mr. Rogers has given you a check. That's a type of payment, so that's a revenue. Refund to Mr. Zibbit. That's an interesting last name. By the sounds of this, it's a refund to them. So you're giving them money back. That's going to be an expense. And in terms of whether it's fixed or variable, we can assume it's variable because it's probably a one-time thing. Payment from Mr. Oswich, I guess. I don't know how to say that, but that's a revenue. Employee salary. Now, that is a little bit up in the air. It doesn't say whether you are earning that salary or you're paying that salary. I would actually make the assumption that since it's an employee salary, it's probably you paying it. So I would say that's a variable. No, not a variable. That would be a fixed expense. You got to pay for your employees at a fixed rate. Payment from Mrs. Zedrikowski. Okay, so it's a payment from someone. That's revenue. Monthly fee paid for advertisement. Well, it's a monthly fee. Sounds like it's going to be the same every single time. Not to mention it's a nice round number like that. That's kind of your hint. That's going to be a fixed expense. Telephone bill, it even tells you it's a flat rate plan. That's a fixed expense. Payment from Mr. Ozaki, that would be a revenue. And payment from Miss Lee, that is also a revenue. See, when you break it down and you really think about which one is which, hopefully it doesn't become too hard. Some of them are a little debatable. Again, like you could say groceries might be a fixed expense, but in this one, definitely we saw those two. They changed, so it's got to be variable. All right, so profit. Your total revenue must be more. So your revenue must be more than your total expenses in order to make a profit. If your expenses are more, we call that a loss. And if your revenue and your expenses are equal to each other, we say that's breaking even. Okay, so a break-even point is where your revenue and your expenses are the same. And I really should say your total revenue and your total expenses. Gotta be the same. All right, so here's another example. The following are the revenue and expenses for running Vaughn's Bakery. Calculate the profit or loss for the month and suggest a way for the bakery to break even without changing their sales. So in this case, we're not going to go talk about whether it's a fixed expense or a variable expense. Let's just label these as either revenues or expenses, okay? Because that's going to help us. For all intents and purposes, let's consider revenues things that are positive and expenses things that are negative. That way we can subtract our expenses away and add our revenues together, okay? So bakery, monthly revenue and expenses, rent. Well, I'm going to assume rent is actually one of your expenses. You're paying your rent to have your bakery, so that's an expense. So we're going to be subtracting that. Wages for a bakery. Wages for a bakery is an expense. You're paying your employees, so we're subtracting that. Sales. Sales is what you're actually selling in terms of your bakery. That is a revenue, so we'll say that's adding. Loan payment. So you took out a loan for this. That's going to be an expense, so we got to subtract that. Food and ingredients, that is definitely an expense. In order to run a bakery, you have to actually buy the flour and all that. So in other words, that is going to be an expense. We'll subtract it. Utilities, so that means like your power and your water bill, that's an expense. We'll subtract it. Insurance, that's another expense. We have to subtract it. Van insurance, apparently you have like a bakery van, that's an expense. Subtract it. Gas for your van, clearly an expense. Subtract it. And then salary for Vaughn. Now, here's what's interesting. It's Vaughn's Bakery. He's the one who owns it. But remember, what you would usually do is you would keep your bakery revenue and expenses separate from your own personal finances. You got to consider your business as one thing and your own personal finances another. You own your own business. You're getting your own salary. This guy's actually putting it as part of his bakery's monthly revenue and expenses. While that's a revenue for Vaughn, for the bakery, that's actually an expense. And the reason we consider that an expense is because it's coming out of the bakery's bank account, basically, to pay Vaughn. Even though Vaughn's the one who probably owns the bakery, it's got to still be an expense. So we got to subtract that. That kind of cuts our work out for us here. So what we got to do is we got to like add all this together. What I would start with, just before we even begin, we'll start at 0, and I'll go 0 minus this, plus this, and so on. So just give me a chance here. I'm going to go 0 minus 1,200 minus 3,200 plus 10,000 minus 226 minus 3,000 minus 150 minus 250 minus 195 minus 225 and minus 2,200. And this gives us a total, if you do all that together, of negative $646. Well, since this number is negative, that tells us we have a loss. So in other words, with this bakery's current revenue and expenses, they're not going to be making any money. So the next part of the question says, suggest a way for the bakery to break even without changing their sales. Now remember, breaking even means you want your revenue to be exactly equal to your expenses. Let's have a look through the list of all of our revenue and expenses. Keep in mind we only have one form of revenue, and we've been told we can't change their sales. We can't change their sales. So in other words, that number's got to stay put. Well, since we have a loss, that's kind of indicating to us that we actually have to lower some of our expenses. So we're going to have to make some cuts from something. It's up to you where you want to make your cuts. And again, it could come in many different places. But perhaps one thing, because again, we need to make up this extra $646. One thing we can say for sure is you might be tempted to get rid of your van, but if you notice the van in total is only costing these two combined. And that definitely doesn't quite equal 600 bucks. I think if you add those together, it'd be just over 400 bucks. So in other words, that's not going to quite be enough. So maybe that's not a place to cut, or at least not solely that place. What you might end up having to do is look at the rest of your whole thing and say, okay, what can't move? Your rent can't move. You have to pay your rent one way or another, so that one's staying. Wages could go down if you laid off some of your workers, so that one might go. Loan payments, you probably can't get rid of that one. Food and ingredients, you can't get rid of that one either. Your bakery. Your utilities isn't going anywhere. Insurance, you can't have a business without your insurance. So that really just leaves a few things to cut. You can cut the wages. So in other words, you'll either have to lay off some staff members or you'll have to lower what they're getting paid. You could lower your own salary. That would be another option. You could get rid of the van. And by the looks of it, that's about it, right? So those are the ones, like the ones I circled, those are the only things you could actually really tackle in this case to actually start getting closer to breaking even. But either way, with the way that this bakery is currently set up, they are going to be losing money. So they have to change something to keep their bakery afloat, okay? Anyway, we're almost done here. Making profitable decisions. Business owners need to make decisions that maximize their profitability. These include the location of your business. So in other words, you got to keep in mind, what are you selling and who are you selling to and where would be the best place to operate your business. For instance, if you operated a convenience store, right, like a 7-Eleven kind of thing, if you're operating a convenience store, you don't want to put it way out in the middle of nowhere where no one's going to want to go to it, right? A convenience store should probably be somewhere near a lot of people's houses, or at least near like a downtown area or something where people are going to be more likely to stop. Where you buy your goods and materials, remember, business owners have to buy their materials from somewhere. So businesses need to buy from other businesses. You got to think about where you're buying yours from so you can maximize either the lowest cost or the highest quality, or whatever suits your situation. Next one, how much do you charge for your goods and services? You don't want to charge too much because then people aren't going to go to your business, but you don't want to charge too little either because, again, you're going to be reducing the amount of profit you can have. Hours or times of the year of operation. You could cut back on some of your hours if you don't have many people coming into your store at certain times of day. Like let's say you have a store that, maybe nobody comes in first thing in the morning. There's no point in being open in the morning then and paying wages to people who, might not have any customers in, right? Number of employees, that's another obvious one, right? So in other words, how many people are you going to hire and how are you going to advertise, right? So are you going to advertise on TV, on radios, on billboards? Are you going to advertise a lot? Are you going to advertise hardly at all? Are you going to advertise online? Like where are you going to do your advertising? That's important to think about as well. All right, we're done. That was it. Told you it was going to be a pretty quick lesson today. So page 310 to 320, I want you to work on those questions that are in that section there. And then I've got some good news for you. We only have one more section to cover after this. As always, if you need any help, please let me know.